You just might be right, Mr. Just might be right, Mr. Just might be right,
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and all aboard the Psychonautilus. Welcome aboard for Voyage the 22nd. Yeah, it's going to be a bit of a kind of follow-up show to the last Voyage, which was the Reimagining Antiquity, where I broadly, sort of in broad brushstrokes, covered some of the problems with the mechanics of dinosaurs and our current planetary mechanics, the problem with where the oceans came from, and also to some degree megalithic building and the sort of use of giganticism in the sort of stone construction of prehistory. Within that, I covered some of the electric universe theory guys' stuff on the potential flyby of Mars, having created all sorts of interplanetary heck. But tonight, there's been a whole bunch of stuff that I've really wanted to sort of clarify to my satisfaction in order to be able to come to air with a degree of confidence about what I'm saying, because I really, most of the stuff that I'm talking about, I at least feel that I've done a reasonable level of due diligence on and have arrived at some sort of a meaningful conclusion about those researches. But on this occasion, I'm kind of confronted by a whole bunch of stuff that just seems to not want to resolve to any real clarity. So I'm just going to kind of throw out the problems and perhaps in airing them, that sort of magic thing that happens between the brain and the microphone, with the mouth as the interceding medium, might work its magic spell once more and allow me to say something that actually informs me as well as it does you, which is not that. It happens more often than I would really like to admit. To some degree, the difficulties that I've been having with approaching the shows have often been a case of this not having arrived at any kind of a synthesis of the materials that I'm researching, and like I say, a desire to be able to present some sort of a coherent, meaningful picture kind of steps in the way, or in my sort of confusion about a subject, I'll find that in trying to talk about it, I'll be presented with all of the sort of contradictory statements along with the confirmatory ones, and we'll find it very hard to sort of sift quite what to say about it. Anyway, so let's kind of go boldly forth with a little revisit of the last voyage and this reimagining antiquity. And I presented a potential hypothesis to explain the magnitude order of the force of gravity this planet would have had to have been subjected to in order to make dinosaurs even a physical possibility. Because if they were alive today, they'd all be dead. Broken necks, exploded hearts, burst jugular veins, you know what I mean? You name it, they couldn't do it under the current sort of climate. So to anybody that has given even the most passing of analysis of the extraordinary claims that are made of the sizes of these creatures, and also the fact that they bear such grazing resemblances to the creatures that they are supposed to be the precedents of in some sort of evolutionary path, all raises really deep suspicions to me, unless the climate was so radically different and that biology worked in a more or less unimaginable way. that if biology was biology and the Earth was the Earth, then those buggers didn't come from here. Which raises the potential for them having come from Mars, and all in a big dollop. So essentially we have this issue with the northern hemisphere of Mars being scalloped and eroded down to kilometres deep. So a large portion of the surface of Mars has gone missing. Then we have this issue with these critters with patently impossible body forms, impossible morphologies to exist on this particular planet in this particular condition. So either this planet got a lot bigger and a lot heavier between then and now, or they came from a planet that's a lot smaller. Well, we have a planet that's a lot smaller. It's Mars. And it used to be inside Earth, and now it's outside Earth. And so if you have this interplanetary lightning acting like the plasma between the electrode of an arc welder and the earth plate, then we literally have a mechanism for vacuuming the material off of one thing, and what would be known as sputtering, the spraying through the ion flow of a plasma onto another surface, in common terminology, arc welding. I suppose in order to sort of give some sort of a visual metaphor, well, not even a metaphor, but a description of what actually happens here. In an arc welder, you clamp the earth lead to the workpiece, the thing that you want to join together, and you clamp the welding rod into the anode, into the rod clamp, the positive lead, and then you strike the anode on the cathode and draw out an electric arc. Well, an electric arc is a plasma, and what this does is it creates such a localized high energy field in the small gap between the struck electrode and the plate that it tears apart the air in between and renders it to such high temperatures that it will not only melt the welding rod, but also the sort of ceramic glass-like substance that they surround them with, literally instantaneously. And having melted these, the ion transport, which goes in the opposite direction to the electron flow, carries this molten material onto the workpiece, and that this is what's deposited as the welded surface with its glazed coating, which is the slag that you have to chip off. This is basically to prevent oxygen from entering the situation. With a MIG welder, they use shroud gases rather than the ceramic coating, but more or less the principle is the same. So effectively we have this situation where we have Mars flying past Earth, and this would lead me to assume that Earth in this particular circuit would have been the anode, and that Mars having the more electronegativity, possibly simply due to its circumference. Basically, when you're talking about a ball capacitor, circumference is absolutely key to understanding the electrical properties. And so having a smaller ball capacitor coming into close proximity of a large ball capacitor, one carrying a much higher charge than the other, then the charge will simply dissipate and find its equilibrium between the two. In this case, holy heck lightning between the two planets, hence the thunderbolts of the gods. Now my suggestion is that this would be like the anode of the... In fact, yeah, no, because that would go the other way around, wouldn't it? You see, this is some of the problems I have with trying to think about this stuff, is that everything's back to front. The The bloody electron flow is the opposite way to any motion of a motor. Oh, hold on, is it? Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah. So electrons go from negative to positive. Motors turn as if the electrons are going from positive to negative, which is why they got that round the wrong way in the first place. So anyway, we had the top of Mars going missing, and all of these archaeological deposits on this planet that are huge layers of sedimentary deposits full of these kind of alien-looking creatures that bear almost no relevance to anything that we're familiar with here on Earth. While they're rattling around in the kitchen there, I'm going to stick this on quickly. A little 10-minute section from, I think it's about an hour and a half, Thunderbolts Project video, entirely dedicated to all of the weirdness and anomalies of the lightning-scarred planet Mars.
Our celestial neighbor, the planet Mars. Astronomers once considered Mars to be a long, barren, and geologically dead rock in space. But since the arrival of our probes beginning in the 1960s, the planet has come alive for us. It does not reveal the inactive and worn-down landscape astronomers and planetary scientists had expected. Nevertheless, investigators continue to apply geologic concepts based on their understanding of the Earth and the Moon. They could only see volcanism, erosion, surface movement, and surface collapse, all punctuated by episodic impacts from space over billions of years. What force created the sharply cut gouges and depressions across the surface of Mars, looking as if a giant trowel descended to scoop out material at radically different and irreconcilable depths? Running north to south, we see massive interwoven scratches or grooves extending hundreds of miles. And how remarkable that a planet only half the diameter of Earth exhibits canyons on a scale dwarfing anything seen on our own planet, and mountains that would tower over Mount Everest. Today, no planet outside the Earth has received more attention than Mars. But the mysteries and theoretical contradictions have grown spectacularly. For decades now, investigators have wondered why the two hemispheres of Mars look as if they were formed in different worlds. A southern hemisphere dominated by craters, a northern hemisphere with only sparsely scattered craters. And note the contrasting crustal depths of the two hemispheres. Shallow crust in the north, much thicker crust in the south. Why would a planet evolving in isolation display such a profound dichotomy? It's as if some unknown force excavated the northern crust miles deep. The hemispheric removal of crustal material requires a force external to Mars, acting on the planet. But when it comes to external events, scientific convention has only one thing to work with: random collisions. Could a planetoid or huge asteroid crashing into Mars have removed millions of cubic miles of crust? A shattering impact is all that theory would allow. But what would Martian history look like were we to include electrical events, events on a scale sufficient to sculpt the surface of the red planet from pole to pole? Of all the enigmatic features in the solar system, perhaps none provokes greater amazement than Valles Marineris, the largest canyon on any planet or moon. The deep trench complex stretches a third of the way around the planet, hundreds of times larger than the Grand Canyon. It would reach from San Francisco to New York and beyond. Prior theory of planet formation had never anticipated such a chasm on a small planet. What natural force excavated this colossal trench? With the arrival of the Mariner probes, NASA scientists thought the chasm could have been cut by water erosion, though nothing even close was ever achieved by water on the known watery planet, Earth. On any erosional hypothesis, 3 million cubic miles of material were removed. 3 million cubic miles, and it had to go somewhere. neither the means of fluid drainage nor the vast outflow required are in evidence. Now we know that the Valles Marineris reaches to a greater depth than any outflow channel originally envisioned, and the tributaries imagined by some turned out to be cleanly cut alcoves and stubby depressions. They are not connected to feeder streams at all. One portion of the Valles Marineris system in particular underscores our point here. Planetary scientists acknowledge that Hebe's Canyon, much larger than our Grand Canyon, is an inseparable part of Valles Marineris. As scientists have now acknowledged, it was certainly not created by water. Nor is it plausible to suggest that surface spreading created the massive chasm of Valles Marineris, with its repeated morphology of sharply scalloped walls. The surface was not torn, it was carved, and the detailed images imply a removal of material along the entire length of the chasm, a process clearly illustrated by the neatly machined so-called tributaries all the way up to their rounded, cleanly cut terminations. Whatever formed the canyon complex did not stop at the margins of the primary channel, but added irregular craters and crater chains and surface grooves and gouges. So the question cannot be escaped. Is there anything known to science today that can account for the extraordinary profile of Valles Marineris? There is an explanation well known to science, though it's never entered the geologist's lexicon. Lightning. In the plasma laboratory, its power is demonstrated in electric discharge experiments. But the form unfamiliar to conventional science today is the cosmic thunderbolt. It was the brilliant engineer Ralph Jurgens who first suggested decades ago that a cosmic thunderbolt carved Valles Marineris. With the benefit of more recent data, electrical theorist Wallace Thornhill returned to this extraordinary possibility. Yes, the electric hypothesis will unnerve many scientists, but it is the only hypothesis that meets the test of direct observation. Here is a scar left by an electric arc on a piece of wet wood. Electric discharge provides a direct and complete explanation for the Valles Marineris. The so-called tributaries of the valley were cut by secondary streamers of the discharge. That is a typical signature of an electric arc when it cuts a surface channel. And here is the scar from electric discharge to an insulator. Notice in particular the network of secondary streamers to the left, a perfect counterpart to the western edge of Valles Marineris. It was long held that this remarkable region on Mars was the result of uplift, fracturing, and spreading, and from a distance it did look like fracturing. But with a closer view in front of us, it is simply irrational to cling to that interpretation. Material has been cleanly removed, exactly as in the discharging to the insulator. The evidence now available demands a new perspective, a larger field of view. In Thornhill's interpretation, the discharge took the form of a plasmoid, not unlike the plasmoid from which a spiral galaxy is formed. On his website, Thornhill noted how the discharge effect spiraled upward to the east and downward to the west, an effect that shows up quite clearly on the elevation map given on his website. In fact, if we extend the view of the elevation map, we see an even larger effect. It seems that the spiraling trails to the east and west nearly completed 2 circles as they swung back toward the trench itself. But one difference between the northern and the southern extension stands out. The northern extension is entirely constituted of ravines and depressions, while the southern extension consists of ridges and mountainous terrain. For this unusual contrast, electrical experiments offer a startling explanation. It was George Christoph Lichtenberg who in the 18th century first showed that electric arcs create ravine networks on more negatively charged surfaces and elevated ridges on more positively charged surfaces. Could it be that simple? That a cosmic thunderbolt carving Valles Marineris acted on two regions of different charge, negative to the north and positive to the south. If such was the case, the only plausible cause of the charge differential would be an electrical exchange between Mars and other charged bodies in the past. And what was the relationship of these events to the hemispheric dichotomies? The removal of crustal material to the north and the densely cratered southern hemisphere. In the electrical interpretation, the violent excavation of the surface to create Valles Marineris would have created immense deposits of sediment on surrounding topography. And indeed, we see that previous craters in the region were completely buried, with only the largest craters appearing as outlines penetrating through the deep deposits. It's apparent that the released material had a net drift to the west, since the blanket of deposited sediment stretches all the way to the eastern flank of the towering Olympus Mons. Keep in mind as well that an electric discharge at energies necessary to create the chasm of Valles Marineris would have ejected great volumes of rocky material into space. Much of the rocky debris would have fallen back to litter the Martian landscape. And indeed, shattered rock of all sizes across the surface of Mars is a long-standing mystery, and the mystery is resolved by electrical events on a continental and even hemispheric scale. Given the energies of the events, considerable volumes of material would have surely escaped the planet altogether. And what might this tell us about the Mars-Earth connection in our reconstruction of ancient events? Or the surprising discovery that rocks from Mars have fallen on our own planet?
Yeah, the awesome Captain Beefheart there with Plastic Factory. Before that was Thunderbolt's Project. I should know who that was speaking as it goes. Hold on. It wasn't Will Thornhill. It was... Is that David Talbot? I think that might have been David Talbot. Anyway, presenting the electrically scarred Mars hypothesis. But you'll notice even in that piece, the furthest that those guys are prepared to go is to suggest that some of the debris from the electrical scarring of Mars landed on Earth. Well, my suggestion is that near enough all of the electrically scarred debris from Mars landed up on here, hence the 50-foot high cliffs of mud that form the fossil-loaded cliffs of places like Poole in Dorset, just down the road from our Nick Nomick. So go check it out, Nick. Come back and tell me what you think. Last time I was there, I was like 8 years old. Yeah, so this is, you know what I mean? This isn't necessarily something that happened on a single occasion. My assumption is that if Mars really overtook Earth and moved from an inner Earth orbit to an outer Earth orbit, and that is the source of the massive electrical scarring that is evident on the atmosphereless, oceanless surface of Mars, basically being a kind of cast-in-stone record of the events of the past, where the sort of biologically active, atmospherically and oceanographically bound Earth has constant kind of erosion forces that remove the direct evidence. However, I would suggest that to everybody that's intrigued by this possibility, that it's not just electrically scarred Mars. I think that the Grand Canyon appeared in this same event. I suspect that things like the Himalayas appeared in this event, that the oceans appeared in this event, and that this event wouldn't have been a single isolated one-off flyby, that this would have potentially have been if Mars was moving from an inner Earth orbit to an outer Earth orbit, then it would have had to have spent a significant period of time sharing more or less the same orbit as Earth. And so then with the differential between the two orbital speeds, it's only a matter of time before these two kind of line up with each other, and this would have been a fairly reliable, predictable thing that would have been coming on for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, and gone on for thousands of years. So any pre-Diluvian cultures would have had potentially quite a lot of warning, and that this could explain the need for these huge megalithic fortresses, because they're not defending themselves against each other. The forces that they're trying to resist are unearthly. We have the sort of the underground cities of the Middle East. We have the dolmens of England. We have what are thought of as tombs in the megalithic burial sites. And again, burial sites. Not that the inhabitants of them didn't build a good enough air raid shelter for that year's Mars flyby and got roasted on the spot. And this is my other issue as well, is that we don't have any transition fossils. I mean, even Mahatma, who doesn't believe in dinosaurs, is just happy to admit that he used to be an avid fossil collector in his youth. I assume the smaller types of fossils, much the same as I had. Well, why aren't there any not quite fossils? The nearest thing that I know to it are those sort of ammonite-type deposits in Poole, where the ammonites appear to be more or less still clay, where the clay cliff is kind of eroding as quickly as it's drying out. And if you get like to a fresh bit of cliff with an exposed fossil, it's usually still quite wet, and the fossil isn't dried out enough to actually be stone, and is essentially still a kind of a bound clay. But it's still a fossil. It's still entirely mineral. There's no animal left there. There's no calcium to be seen or what have you. And this, I mean, this really raises some issues with me. But then we have things like dinosaur nests apparently being discovered. Well, this would perhaps suggest that these things arrived en masse from Mars in a huge interplanetary exchange of surface material, and that I guess there's a remote possibility that, like the sort of occasional people that get picked up in a hurricane and instead of getting torn to pieces and battered with planks of wood, get deposited gently on some completely random part of the country, well, maybe some of these critters ended up landing here and not having expired through the experience, or maybe eggs were transported and they hatched when they arrived. Or maybe none of them arrived alive and everything got so incinerated en route that this explains the sort of incredible level of mineralisation that we see. And there's no point in saying, well, no, there isn't a single lab on Earth that could reproduce those conditions meaningfully. Those sort of electrical fields are just inconceivable to human hands, and regardless of how much you were to scale the experiment down, you wouldn't have the mega currents, you wouldn't have the mega voltages. It would just be a different world. You wouldn't have zero gravity in between the two, around the plasma. However, if gravity is an electromagnetic effect rather than some mysterious effect derived from the Higgs boson, then it's entirely possible that the plasma flow itself would have had some sort of internal gravitational effect that may have literally have sucked the seas off of Mars like a big straw. And so everything that was caught up in those oceans that could survive the few minutes between the two planets, or whatever the transit time was, and happened to arrive softly enough, perhaps could go on to populate the mythology of dragons and odd creatures from our ancestry. Anyway, so that's that kind of bit. Oh, that was what I was going to say, yeah. So but that's the electrically scarred Mars. We'll take a look at Lichtenberg. Yeah, there we go, Lichtenberg figures. So it's Lichtenberg figures, Lichtenberg figures. And have a look on Google and Google image search that, and you will see the most incredible array of images of discharge of high energy electricity, largely high voltage electricity, into an insulator. So they're usually into things like acrylic or wood, and we get this typical sort of lightning pattern. But if you look at the detailed structures within a Lichtenberg figure, and then go and look on Google Maps, Google Earth, and have a look at the shapes of the coastlines and of the grand features of the geological scale stuff around us, and then start to maybe look into the shapes of mountains, the peaks of mountains, and again compare the structures that you see to the shapes that are created in those Lichtenberg figures. And I'd suggest to you that all mountains are potentially these, what would they be, anode tufts, I believe, and that potentially the sort of craters that we're told are impact craters from these things falling from outer space are in fact nothing other than the cathode indentations from the witness of a huge electric arc. Okay, so we got a planet that you can kind of find out which way's up on with a compass, which is a simple magnet on a bevel, on a swivel, and that one end of the magnet will always point north and one end of it will always point south. Magnetism in and of itself is a bit of a mystery, and if you go looking into it, you will find the most perfunctory descriptions of how it's arrived at. I believe that in Wall-Thornhill's model, it's the kind of frozen eccentricity that in the induction of during the manufacturing of a magnet, in the induction of the magnetism, this is done at such a high field effect that it effectively shocks all of the internal structures of the atoms and basically knocks all of their electron rings to one side. And then when the field's taken away, the peculiarities of the magnetic substances hold that kind of off-kilter electron balance. And what this means is it moves all of the nucleuses with their protons to one side and moves the electrons to the other side, giving a permanent kind of electropositivity and electronegativity. This again may be a hugely simplistic model, and like I say, I'm not entirely convinced of electrons, protons and neutrons. So to some degree this is another sort of low resolution. The map is not the territory. It's a reasonable description of what's there and is useful when it comes to modelling or modelling or planning an electric circuit or whatever. It's a good enough fit. But the problem is the territory that I'm going into is that good enough isn't enough. Anyway, so that's another problem that I've got. Tectonic plate theory. Tectonic plate theory has troubled me since I was in my early days of secondary school. So 10, 11, 12 years old. I went to after-school geology classes because they weren't taught at our school, so I had to actually attend after school. Probably paid more attention in those classes than I did during the entire school day. And we were given this model of these floating crustal plates with deposition being occurring at the volcanic fringes, mostly happening under the ocean, so the mid-Atlantic ridge. And if you look on sort of Google Earth, you will see that the Earth under the ocean has sort of fault lines running pretty much all over the place, and that submarine exploration of these fault lines has shown almost like the annular rings of a tree with lines of new deposits being forced outwards from a central point and growing out like the rings of a tree, but in sort of linear fashion out from the fault. And then we're told that these forces push the continents in various directions, and that at their fringes we have subduction going on, and that this is the reason for the San Andreas Fault, because the entirety of the west coast of America is disappearing under the Pacific crust, coastal crust, forcing the sort of frozen mantle that is Los Angeles under the frozen mantle that is the undersea bed of the Pacific Ocean. But the problem is that there's very little actual evidence of this occurring. I mean, it's suggested that this is such a slow process that it would be more or less immeasurable, and certainly the measurement problem does come into it. But it's such a simplistic view of the structures involved, and has sort of developed into another one of these, things of the mysterium, that the Earth's crust and its interior is another, we can't possibly know, but from what we do know, it's just like this, and there's a molten iron core, and it's twisting up with internal tornadoes, and frankly, I'm not having any of it. So the fact that everybody in the chat room is all more or less agreeing that there's no such thing as dinosaurs when I started, that's like kind of, par for the course, really. So I'm constantly looking at trying to look at the evidence and not the explanation. And so I'm constantly presented with statements about observations that have been made about a particular subject, and often I literally find myself tearing my hair out listening to the speaker, because they're so entrenched within their paradigm that they don't even seem to recognise. What was it I was watching last night? Oh, The Day the Dinosaurs Died on BBC. Oh my God, what a farce. Anyway, just, and if you were to watch the same programme, so perhaps you should, I'm not recommending that anybody watch any BBC programme, I don't know what the hell I was doing watching it. And they just enraged me. But essentially they've got these, mountain tops, covered in dinosaur bones, just scattered all about the surface. You got like 20-foot deep sedimentary deposits, in inverted commas, with dinosaur bones littered throughout them. It's just like, well, what if these things landed from above? And like a rain of frogs, and he kind of roasted dead frogs in a load of clay. Anyway, I'm rambling and it's near the hour.